The Museum of Contemporary Art Denver presents Practicing Citizenship, a conversation series featuring artists, activists, and experts exploring civic engagement. Tonight, we bring you a zine making workshop with the Denver Zine Library. And now, here's Sarah Bai, MCA Denver's Director of Programming.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me? Hi, I am Sarah Bai, and I'm the Director of Programming here at MCA Denver. And this is Practicing Citizenship, which is a program series we're producing in conjunction with the exhibition Citizenship, a Practice of Society, which is on view now at the Museum of Contemporary Art Denver. We're coming to you live every Wednesday night throughout the run of the exhibition. And tonight is Making Zines at Home, which is a zine making workshop that we're presenting with the Denver Zine Library. And this program is a little different than the others in that we are together virtually in this Zoom room with the Denver Zine Library, who's hosting the event. The Denver Zine Library is an all volunteer run lending library of over 15,000 zines. They opened in 2004. They hopped around to a few locations and they now live in the Temple on 24th and Curtis. They are currently closed for COVID, but when they reopen, they are open on weekends and by appointment. And I'm joined also by Caitlin Lafferty. Caitlin is a librarian and workshop with the Denver Zine Library. She's been with the library for over 6 years. She also works at MCA Denver. We are delighted to have her here. Please welcome Caitlin, and I'll turn it over to you.
Cool. Hey, everyone. So as Sarah mentioned, I'm Caitlin. I'm going to be leading the workshop today. So I just want to make sure before we get started that everyone has their materials in front of them. So paper to fold, scissors, glue, things to draw with. Just like gives me a thumbs up if you have it, if you're on your camera. Cool. Everyone looks prepared. I see a lot of thumbs ups, which makes me super happy. Cool. Great. So we'll get started. I feel like people are still hopping in, so we'll go through this. So the zine is going to just basically be a very brief history of zines and kind of how they work in the idea of citizenship. And we're also going to end the workshop by making our own 8-page zines to the prompt, what does citizenship mean to us? And throughout the workshop, you'll kind of get a taste of like how zines meld into that idea, and then you can explore more of that in your zine at the end. Cool. So let's get started. Has anyone heard of zines before? This is a very participatory workshop, so if you have, raise your hand. Cool. So many people. This is rad. Cool. Does anyone have like a good definition they have for zines? Or like some qualities that you think zines usually have? And also like feel free to jump on the mic. I would love to hear your voices. Cool. So I'll start. So often what I associate with zines is that they're usually very DIY and self-published. So a lot of the times they're made by an individual or a group of individuals who submit to a zine. Generally, they're very small circulated, so you don't see a lot of zines that are mass produced and like the whole United States knows about. Rather, you see zines that are very popular in communities or in like a small group of people. And zines too, I think this is probably the most relevant thing about zines is that zines to citizenship is that zines are usually about things that mass media doesn't cover. So this gives a lot of power to the people making zines because there's no editor involved. They can write about their personal lives, their experiences. They can write about things that they don't see in the world, that they want to see in the world. So there's a lot of like freedom and power. I see one person in the chat says, to me, a zine is specific and somewhat personal. I think that's a really good view. I totally agree. generally they're very specific. One thing I really like about zines too is that even when you're talking, a lot of zinesters write about maybe a big issue, like a broad issue, maybe like citizenship, or maybe like politics. Generally, they write about it in a very individual way. So they'll say I a lot, and they'll talk about their stories. So yeah, that's kind of how I would define zines. So zines take many forms. Some folks are more like they come from the book arts world, and some folks come from that very DIY, like cut and paste aesthetics kind of world. So I'm gonna hop into a little bit of history. Oh, someone said they bought a handmade zine out of a refurbished cigarette machine. That's awesome. I love those. Cool. So let's get started with a little history. And obviously this is going to be very brief because zines go back a really long time and they kind of thread very closely to other forms of like publishing and printmaking. So some say that zines started back in the 1920s with fanzines. There were a lot of like popular communities formed around like just appreciating and loving like sci-fi culture at that time. So people would just make zines about their love of science fiction. And they would specifically write about like their community and how they were involved with it. I like to say that Thomas Paine's Common Sense is a really good example of like where zines came from, or even the abolitionist pamphlets. If you think about like the history of the country, when slavery was happening, there were a lot of like Black abolitionist writers who like wrote pamphlets and then gave those to people who were in the fields or who were organizing, and they were like very informational. They're like, yo, go here, or like more of like theory based or like community based calls to action, or just like being together. So I like to say that zines kind of have their history there, at least in this country, because it gives a lot of emphasis on like how zines are counter narrative to a lot of the big movements in the country, or the status quo, I should say. And so jumping from the 1920s to the 1960s, zines kind of explode. So at this point, we see rock and roll come on the scene. We see like the precursors to punk happen. So counterculture is booming. And you see also the beat generation before rock and roll. There's a lot of like intersections in how people are publishing and sharing their works. And there's also a lot of like subculture development in that period of the country in our history. So that's kind of when they start to really explode. And then you get to the 70s and the 80s. And this is where that kind of like iconic, gritty, like black and white cut and paste zine. If you've ever seen those, they're kind of iconic to DIY. That's where those are kind of most known from. And printing at this point becomes really easy. So people are sharing their zines, and it's very connected to the music scene at the time. And punk is very counterculture. It's very much to talk about the ills of capitalism, of representation, of like, I don't know, democracy, other things. And my favorite movement is 80s queercore. So this is a splintering off of the punk movement, which was in the 70s. And so in the 80s, queercore arises from a group of people who are like, yo, punk is really white. It's really cis male. I don't see a lot of like queer people represented. I don't see a lot of like Black and Indigenous people represented, or like POC, like trans folks. So queercore begins, and I mean, the splintering of the punk is a very interesting thing, but zines are really interconnected with that. So that's really cool. And I think it's also just another representation of how even in DIY movements and underground movements, there isn't always, it's not always perfect. and there's a lot of like change and need for representation that happens. So I think that's a really good example of how that was pushed. And Riot Girl in the 90s is another really good example. As you know, their kind of like motto is girls to the front. And yeah, in punk shows, they would make sure that girls would come to the front of the concerts because there was a lot of like kind of aggression in those concerts because of the dominant like white male audience. And so those zines often were very personal as well. Someone says, yay, Riot Girl. I love that. Yeah, they're super rad. And another one of my favorite parts of Riot Girls is that people would make zines and then they would just like put them in people's like mailboxes. They would like walk down the street and be like, oh, I have a zine for you. And the zine was like very feminist and very personally oriented, which is also really rad. So that kind of is a brief overview of the history of zines in America. Today, zines are, it's like a really big group, a really big community. So generally, communities are built around subgenres. So a few that I can think of are like poetry. I think zines or personal zines are a very popular form of zines that you see today. And those are kind of like more diary centered. A lot of people sharing their own stories and maybe focusing on the political through their own lens. So there's a lot of focus on subjectivity and kind of like the political as personal. It's my favorite type of zine. But also zines are really good ways to communicate big issues to maybe an audience of activists, or to get to people kind of like theory-based ideas about how their communities can change. So I see a lot of zines about like why defund the police. So there's a lot of like education in those zines and a lot of activism, and it isn't necessarily always personal. So zines are very connected to that as well. So at this point, I have a few examples for you that of zines from the Zine Library. So let's get started. I have a few categories of zines that I think are conducive to kind of how we break down zines at the Denver Zine Library. So this is a set of zines. So I'm sorry, Zoom, if we were in person, you could touch these, but I'm just gonna go over a few of them. So this one, these are kind of like zines that retell history, that look at history through a view that, you know, it's not all been told. In fact, some of it's been erased. So this one's called The Haunt of Colonization. This one's called The Invisibility of Women's Prisoners Activism. And maybe my favorite, Homos in History, 1970s version. And this one kind of takes the form of a comic a little bit, which is really cool. And yeah, this is a good example of how zinesters have the power to reshape history and tell it in the way that people are experiencing it and that it actually happened and not the way that it's told. So those are kind of an example of those. And I have another set of zines that I think is a good example of how zinesters write about alternatives to current systems. So this is really big in the idea of citizenship. Like, we're here, but things aren't, you know, perfect. So a lot of people are writing about like changing the legal system, changing hospitals and social working, and these people who write zines come from these communities. They've experienced these things, and they just want to like share more of their ideas and the way that they think things should be changed. And I think one zine that I really liked is this one. It's called Big Fag. It's about Sakia Gunn, who was a lesbian Black woman who was murdered in New Jersey. And this zine is about kind of the uprising that happened after her death. There wasn't a lot of national focus on her, So this is a per zine about the experience one person has of going to protests and experiencing the kind of disconnect between the broader queer community and maybe the community which was showing up. So I think this is a really good example of how the political is personally represented through a lot of zines. And people do that through storytelling, and they do it through art here. And it's another really great way that people can bring people to movements and also express kind of the urgency and bring out empathy in people. And someone says, is that block printed? It totally looks like it. Yeah. It looks like it's block printed. It comes in this cute little bag as well, which I think is super neat. If you ever want to make a zine and put it in a bag, I would love it and I would buy it. So that's this one. So I'll give you one more example of maybe a zine from Denver. So this is called Intersections. So a Denver, ooh, wow, that looks really bad on the Zoom. I'm sorry, around the camera. But yeah, so this is a Denver-based zinester. This is a call for submissions based zine. So a community of writers get together. And it is about intersectional politics, intersectional, just like living within the intersections. So there are a lot of really cool writers in here. And yeah, they submit. There's a lot of poetry and art and drawings, as you can see. And it's all very, very personal, very political, very much like centering identity, centering discussions of community and belonging, which I think is really rad. And it's Denver based, so check it out. But yeah, so these are a few examples. And I would say that there's just so much to talk about citizenship specifically. So I feel like zines are a really good way to kind of see the multiplicity of conversations that are happening around citizenship. It's not just about immigration, and it's not just about the legal system, though it is very much about those things as well, and about like bringing people into the country and the inhibits there. But it's also about being a citizen, and it's also about community activism and about like your experience as a person in this country, as a person represented in history of this country. So I feel like zines are a very good way of like looking at that, and people are doing it. So those are the examples I have. Did anyone have any comments about the zines that we've seen? Anything else you want to mention? I do want to say one thing about kind of that's zine specific, that isn't just about content. Zines come in all shapes and sizes. So just like for you when you're making zines, I think zines are super cute when they're this small. And I mean, they can be kind of like hard bound. You can send them into places to be bound, but you can also print them from a printer. This one's just stapled. So just to let you know in your own zine practices. Yeah, science is in the so beautiful, love the art specifically. Yeah, I do too. And I think art is a form of activism sometimes. It doesn't necessarily have to be, but I think that's a really cool point. Hi, are the ongoing zines that accept? Oh, I see what you're asking. How about you email the Denver Zine Library and we'll get back to you after this. Cool. Okay, so Joycelyn, I thought zines were only poems, but I see they are so much more than poetry. I'm so glad that you're here and that you think that now. Yeah, zines are way more than just poetry. I feel like poetry zines kind of coexist with chapbooks a little bit. But yeah, zines are, there's so much. You should come to the Zine Library. We have 11,000 zines, and you can definitely see the variety that we have. Cool, so it is 23 minutes into the workshop. If anyone has any other comments, please let me know, or just comment in the chat box. But I think we're ready to make our zines. So what I'm going to do is break us out into breakout rooms so we can fold zines with a few volunteers from the Zine Library. And then we're just going to make a zine about what citizenship means to us. And as I just discussed, like, this is a broad topic, and you can take it any way you want. You can even write poetry, or you can draw or anything. So I'm going to stop recording.